When you hear the word feminism, what comes to mind? This episode launches a multi-part series digging into the real history of feminism, what the early feminists actually believed, how modern feminism drifted, and the bioethical fallout in the realms of sex, contraception, abortion, and women's place in society. In this conversation, Erika Bachiochi, legal scholar, mother of seven, and one of the most compelling voices speaking into women's rights, takes us back to the women who came before us. Women who saw motherhood as a privilege, responsibility as empowerment, and equality as something deeper than sameness. Erika unpacks the sexual asymmetry our culture pretends doesn't exist, the vulnerability women uniquely shoulder, the power men can too easily abandon, and the moral vision early feminists offered to address it, not through promiscuity, contraception, or abortion, but through a revolution of responsibility. This episode exposes the cracks in the sexual revolution, the wounds of hookup culture, and the forgotten call for men and women to live with chastity, honor, and accountability. A false feminism has shaped everything around us. This conversation might challenge what you think you know about equality, freedom, and what women truly deserve. Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Erika Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. Our guest today is EPPC fellow Erika Bachiochi, a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She is a professor of practice at the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, where she teaches courses in the history of political thought, directs the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative for Women in Civic Life and Thought, and serves as editor-in-chief of its online journal, Fairer Disputations. A 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, she remains a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and founded its Wollstonecraft Project. Her latest book, The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021 and was named a finalist for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's 2022 Conservative Book of the Year Award. It is a major scholarly work that has become a touchstone in debates about feminism, the sexual revolution, equality, work, autonomy, and motherhood. It calls us back to a vision of rights rooted in responsibility, community, and embodied human flourishing. And Erika brings intellectual firepower, historical depth, and moral clarity to every discussion. Please join me in welcoming Erika. Hi, Erika.
So much for
Thank you
me.
for
Hi.
being on.
Thanks for having me, Arena.
So first, before we jump into the deep topic of feminism, I wanted to get a little bit about your background and your passion for this topic. So was there a moment in your upbringing, education, or family life that sparked your interest in questions about women, equality, and human dignity?
Many such moments, I guess we could say. I mean, I think, I usually tell the story of being a women's studies student at Middlebury College in the mid-1990s and working for Bernie Sanders, calling myself a socialist feminist, and all these sorts of things. But I do think there's a way in which prior to that, growing up in a family where my mom had, married and divorced 3 times, I had 2 male friends take their own lives, that there was some, foundational problems, some instability, you might say, with regard to questions about marriage, about not so much women's equality. That was something that was never questioned. I think there's a way in which, like, growing up in the 80s and 90s, even though it's strange to think that was such a great time. But I do think there was a way in which, like, myself as someone who, has always been pretty intense and feisty. I was an athlete throughout high school, 3-sport varsity athlete who was very gifted in that way. It never occurred to anyone to question, whether I was a female, whether I was actually a female or male or anything like that. I mean, I just sort of had a freedom to become as excellent as I could be in athletics. So it was, I guess, a good time in that. I mean, I definitely was considered, I think, a tomboy, and there was a freedom in that as well. I think all of that, plus sort of the turmoil because of coming out of the divorces as a girl who, struggled with relationships with boys, or maybe it wasn't at that point struggling. I mean, I just basically did what everybody else was doing around me, which was, so it seemed anyway. I was pretty young, but so I drank, experimented with drugs, and engaged in the kinds of things that girls did when they did those things.
Mhm.
And so I think the fallout of all of that was when the first friend took his own life and I got myself into AA, and I stopped basically having, I guess you could say, to put it really bluntly, the lubricant that allowed me to give my body
Mhm.
over to young men without thinking about the consequences at all, really. And so all of that came to a head when I got to Middlebury, started studying women's studies, and started thinking about these kinds of questions intellectually. Like, I had the foundation then for living in my going to AA and all of that, but I didn't really have like an intellectual apparatus. I didn't realize that sort of Christian understandings were underneath AA. Like, that would have been really revolting to me, I think, because to me, Christianity seemed like, why do you need institutional religion? Like, why do you need a church or anything like that? Like, why can't you just be spiritual? And follow God as you understand God, which is what, of course, I did in AA. So, I think all of that is where, the kind of interest in feminism, you could say, comes from. Interest in questions about like women's dignity, equality, liberty, those kinds of questions, and the contested nature of them in, I think, our time. I guess that would
Mhm.
be the personal and the intellectual coming together.
Right. And, in your studies at Middlebury on women's studies, what were you being taught? Was it a kind of theory that is modern feminism, or how did you really discover your understanding of what the feminists actually thought?
Yeah, so we were not, again, so this is mid 90s, so the kind of postmodernism, post-structuralism of Judith Butler was not yet, in the main in those texts, so we were probably reading more, and I can't tell you exactly who we were reading. I mean, I can tell you we read some Mary Wollstonecraft because I do remember that, and we read, like when in a class I took on reading women's writing, we read Virginia Woolf, of course, but then also Jane Eyre and other, kinds of good texts. But I would say that the radical feminist assumption, I would say, was underlying all of it. That there's an inequality between the sexes in terms of their capacity to be free in the world is, the way that Simone de Beauvoir would think it. Like, men have this kind of capacity for transcendence. Women, their bodies make them imminent and therefore disadvantaged. And so the transcendence that was required, really meant that the technological solution that de Beauvoir and Shimalu's Firestone required of abortion and contraception were kind of obvious,
Mhm.
unquestioned, I would say. And so, that seemed to me to be sort of in the drinking water, not only in my, classes there in women's studies, but also just in the general time period. There was like massive casual sex going on, even though I wasn't engaging in it anymore. And so, of course, like, contraception and abortion was the backstop, or the underlying assumption of all that. And I think there was just beginning to be a crack in, assuming the sexual revolution was this excellent thing, because you started to have some, I would say, backlash based on the ways in which women were harmed by casual sex. And there was some like Take Back the Night stuff that was just beginning to happen, where there was a concern about kind of rape. We now call it, I guess it's now called rape culture or something like that, but there was concern about
Mhm.
rape on campus for sure, and women not being able to walk across campus, without basically having campus police know like where they were and all that. So kind of the sense of women's vulnerability, to casual sex, and really pointing the finger, I think, at men rather than maybe at the women's own culpability in that, or even feminism's culpability in that.
Mhm.
There was no question that I could see of that, but certainly there was like some sort of breakage happening, or some questioning without going at the sexual revolution, as I think more and more feminists are doing today, thankfully.
Mhm.
There was just sort of like, why aren't these things working very well together?
Right. And in your studies, were there when you first encountered these, feminist ideas, what actually resonated with you in what you were studying, and what felt incomplete or unsatisfying?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that obviously resonated is just the idea that, women have the same, intellectual capacities, moral capacities as men, and that there were real vulnerabilities. So, I mean, I can just think of like the kinds of things that would happen sometimes where, I was in an English class and I was invited by the English professor to come back to his office. And it was clear that there was something
Mm,
like nefarious there. Like if you want an A, I mean, I got an A anyway, right? So those kinds of things that like things weren't quite right between the sexes, which obviously I could see from my own upbringing, but not really knowing how like what it was that was the problem, right? So the assumption that women and men were sort of equal in dignity, and so therefore ought to have equal opportunities in education, the workplace, that kind of thing was just seemed sort of basic to me again as someone who was an athlete. um, and I always knew, like, of course, like, the boys were better at soccer, the boys were stronger, the boys were faster. I mean, I had a brother who, would pitch to me. He was younger than me and would he was a pitcher and he would pitch to me in the backyard, and it was clear, like, I couldn't pitch like that. So, like, those kind of asymmetries, those kind of physical asymmetries were always, assumptions as well, but what was assumed in feminism, in modern feminism, and especially, I would say, radical feminism, is that men would always be harmful to women. So, like, they would always use their superior strength against women. And so, again, I mean, there was some evidence of that in terms of what was happening in the casual sex culture. And I would say from my own experience that I was vulnerable
mm,
as a teenage girl, and that I was taken advantage of. Did I not have the kind of moral confidence and moral strength to say no? Well, it wasn't like why would I have done that? So there was, I guess, no considerations of that, except that as it was starting to break around me, I too was starting to question kind of the casual sex culture, and more like seriously, I think, than others around me, because what I could see, because I wasn't engaging in it, is the way in which it really was harming the women around me. So like friends be sad afterwards, crying afterward, those kind of things. And so I started to just put two and two together, and there seemed to be like, and this is the basic, kind of assumption I bring to my writing now, which I saw like in real life, was this tension between kind of the claims for women's equality, liberty, equal opportunity, etc., and the claims of the sexual revolution. Those seem to me to be just in a tension that modern feminism kind of wasn't working out all that well, especially in the sense that, well, if men are always going to be dominating, then how would you ever think that male and female relationships could go forward? And there didn't
mhm,
seem to be like an answer to that. And so, of course, the most radical of radical feminists would just sort of choose lesbian separatism, right?
mhm.
Um, and so I wanted more, and so I started to, like, as I was like a very intense kind of intensely curious, started to just have to ask more questions and kind of go elsewhere for my answers.
Right. And when your conversion happened, conversion of your heart and mind, was it an immediate thing, or was it over a period of time? And how did that develop? Did you change your lifestyle, cold turkey, or was it over time?
Yeah, so my lifestyle, I would say, changed way earlier than the kind of intellectual apparatus or assumptions or
Mhm.
ways in which I kind of thought about my life. So I would say, as someone again who had stopped drinking, stopped acting out, stopped in the sense of like having casual sex, it just kind of freed me to ask more questions about these kinds of things because I wasn't kind of implicated in it myself. And so I also became a person of prayer through AA, and I do think there's something about it. I mean, people, whether, people meditate or do mindfulness or pray, I mean, to me, the reason why prayer became so central is because I really did have the experience that there was, you know, the being, the superior being who I would call God. Like, it wasn't just something psychological that was happening. It was very clear to me that there was someone, right, that I was becoming intimate with. And again, like I didn't relate this to kind of anyone within any religion. I kind of thought like, oh, of course, the religions are all experiencing the same thing I'm experiencing, and they all are kind of equal in their recognition of some higher power. And so people, I just sort of was like, great, if you want to do that, terrific. So all of that was there. So like the moral conversion, you might say, like living my life with a bit more respect for myself and allowing my reasoning capacity to be more free, I would say. And then, of course, prayer kind of opening me up. It wasn't like I went straight at feminism. That's not kind of how it went. I first started to just think about other kinds of questions. So, one of the things that happened is I went down to Washington, D.C., and the real way in which a lot of my concern was animated by, I guess I would say, like a love of the poor, a love of
Mhm.
like the disenfranchised, the weak and the vulnerable, and that I could, and just like a love for justice. So like when I'd been up at Middlebury, before I went down to DC, I worked on a campaign for the workers to unionize, and again for Bernie Sanders, like how he spoke about kind of the vulnerability and disenfranchised really spoke to my heart, I would say. So the very first thing that happened was really kind of opening the possibility in my mind that there could be others politically who thought about questions of the poor differently than Bernie Sanders did. And so that was just going to DC and meeting like someone who'd worked in the Reagan administration and coming to see like, oh, actually, he worked on welfare reform there and he actually thinks about the poor and is concerned about the poor kind of more actually as my father worked with the poor.
Mhm.
My father, was a really important man in the lives of many young people in Manchester, New Hampshire, where he worked with at-risk kids. And, I watch him sometimes. My parents were divorced, so I didn't spend that much time, but I spent more time with him as I got older. And just the way in which he was able to really speak to the kid's heart and get them to like take responsibility for themselves. He was very much a like, take responsibility for yourself kind of guy. And he was a football coach and really inspired, I think, the guys to be, take responsibility for themselves, but also for the team. And so some of that resonated from just what my father had kind of told me in fits and starts when I would see him or what I saw him
Mhm.
act like with these boys. So that was, I
Mhm.
think, the first thing that happened. Another place where there's like kind of a crack. And so sort of some more openness because I was really seeking and, searching at that point intellectually was, having a pro-choice and a pro-life speaker come into the classroom there in Washington where I was doing this like Washington semester. And the pro-choicer who I, thought I totally agreed with because like being pro-choice was like totally, just basic to being a feminist. So that was, and I just found her to be really off-putting is the best way of putting it. I found her to be like the kind of, the stereotypical angry feminist. I don't remember who she is. I just remember that's how I experienced her. And then the other person who came in from the pro life side was Helen Alvarez, who is now a dear friend. And again, I don't remember what she said, but I just remember that her affection for the students, her just kind of being like allowing reason to carry her arguments, her joy, like allowed me to say, well, like, wait a second. I don't think I'd ever met someone who's pro-life before, or if I had, I hadn't heard them like articulate inside of this winsome way their kind of vision of the world. And so that was another thing that opened a crack. And then it was coming kind of face to face in the textbook of Marianne Glendon with the idea that there was, this is in her book Rights Talk. So Marianne Glendon is, a very accomplished professor of law at Harvard Law School, now retired. And in her very, very important book, Rights Talk, there's so much to say about the book, but one of the things that she claimed about the abortion right was that it just allowed, and the abortion right, constitutionally speaking, was that it gave kind of left women alone with their autonomy. And the contrast she made was just how there were these like communities that really, came to women and kind of ministered to them when they were, unexpectedly pregnant. And that to me, there was some linkage in my mind between that community that might minister to women and their and their vulnerability and all of that. There was something that seemed to resonate with me because of my experience in AA,
Mhm.
there are all these people who just like out of the kindness of their heart and also from for themselves wanting to stay sober, that they just spent so much time with me and really helped me so much. And so I thought like, yeah, no, I know that there are people like this. And so why not if there's some people who gather around, broken recovery alcoholics, why wouldn't there be some who would also gather around women in need? And so it just the possibility that there was a community like that just opened myself to something, I guess, some possibility that there was another way of thinking about this, though I wouldn't have kind of put it that way at that time.
Right, and what's interesting is that modern feminists think it's the feminists who gather around you, but no, Planned Parenthood leaves you stranded when you're pregnant and you actually want to keep your baby. It's the pregnancy centers, it's the pro-life movement who embraces you and tries to help you so that you have all the resources you need. And so that to me is a sign of something, obviously a truly pro-life, pro-woman approach to caring for women. I want to turn to your book, we're going to talk a lot about the content of the book. But if you were to just summarize the message of your book in two sentences for the ordinary listener, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that there is an assumption, and certainly I've seen this, and before I wrote the book, I saw this for the most part on the left, but now you're seeing it on the right too, that there is kind of an unbroken line that can be traced from the early proponents of women's kind of equal dignity and rights to modern day feminism. And so I wanted to get back to those early proponents and kind of understand the basis of their claims for women's equal citizenship and equal dignity in marriage and elsewhere, and sort of show how it was that I saw the modern feminist movement really become something like a movement for the sexual revolution, one and the same with that, and show kind of the distinction between the two.
And what part of the book was the hardest to write or most personally transformative? And is there a chapter or an idea in the book that changed you most personally while writing it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the book started, if for those who know the book really started with chapters, I would say 7, 8,
And
and
here's the book
9.
for everybody. The Rights of Women.
Yeah, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. So the book started as kind of putting in conversation two thinkers that I had come to know about and had written about before. And that is, the late jurist, Justice of the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and then Marianne Glendon, who I'd already mentioned. And so I had written about Ginsburg in law review articles prior to this book, and so knew her thinking pretty well, or at least her constitutional law thinking, especially with regard to kind of personal liberty and abortion, but then also with regard to her anti-discrimination law work. So I was pretty convinced by her early advocacy for just her claims as an ACLU attorney that the law ought not have this kind of bright line with regard to sex, and that is that
Mhm.
basically women and even mothers shouldn't be discriminated on the basis of their sex in education, workplace, etc. And that seemed to me to be like just pretty basic understanding of anti-discrimination law that, you know, as a Catholic was basically upheld in the church in my church by the Second Vatican Council. And the way she went about it seemed to me to be very reasonable. So the very first case she took was just with regard to whether a man, just by being a man, should be the kind of guardian of an estate for a son that had predeceased both the mom and the dad, and this is what the Idaho law required, versus like the mom who was like first in time got there first.
Mhm.
And the question should be basically one on merit, like which would make more sense for the man or the woman. What if the woman had all sorts of particular qualities that made her better, was the executor of this estate. So that seemed to me to just be like an obvious thing that ought to have been regarded as protected,
Mhm.
by the Equal Protection Clause of this, U.S. Constitution. So it was again like that articulation, which seemed to me like like a basic equal rights feminism, that seemed to me up and against her work on abortion, her assumption that
Mm,
the abortion right should be that which allows for women and men to be equal. And that seemed to me to be pretty noxious
mhm,
um, because it would assume that men and women weren't equal when women became pregnant without that kind of abortion right. And so I call this market equality, just this idea that
mhm,
women require abortion in order to be the market equals of men. And not only the market equals of men, that market equality is in some way akin to just moral equality, and that seemed to me to be quite false. And so that's where the book started, was there, and kind of putting this really, brilliant jurist up, in conversation really with, I think, the brilliance of someone like Marian Glendon, who had a very different starting point. I would call kind of, Ginsburg more libertarian, and Glendon more communitarian. But then, in talking to actually Mary Eberstadt, who some of your listeners may know, it occurred to me that, maybe people didn't care that Erika Bachiochi, like whoever she is, thought that Glendon had a better, way of putting things and way of thinking about things, and even way of thinking about anti-discrimination and women's rights and women's equal dignity, especially in marriage, but elsewhere, than did Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so I just realized like I needed to go deeper. And that's when
mhm,
I began to start reading more about the early women's rights advocates and their account. Like, what was the philosophical, kind of the political philosophy, the legal philosophy that underlined their rights claims? And that was kind of amazing to me. And it wasn't really until reading Wollstonecraft again, Mary Wollstonecraft, so the late 18th century, philosopher and author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I'd read her as a women's studies student, but I read like a teeny little clip,
mhm,
which is basically what people taught and people still teach, I think, with her, is, basically like she was an advocate for women's education. Isn't that great? And then I kind of thought, well, women are educated, so like, why do I need to care about this anymore? So I went back, partly because the early women's rights advocates themselves. So this is like American women in the mid 19th century had republished all of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in Susan B. Anthony Elizabeth Cady Stanton's newspaper Revolution. And so I was like, all
mhm,
right, if they took this woman seriously, I better go and learn about her. Because what I did know is that those early women's rights advocates, without known exception, were against abortion. And so there was like some hint that they thought very differently about women's rights than did modern feminists, who again, Ginsburg, but then, de Beauvoir, and really, really starting there in some sense, that abortion kind of line this idea of women's equality. And so like clearly they had very different views just on the basis of thinking that abortion was like a sacred right for women versus thinking
mhm,
it was actually harmful not only to the unborn child for these 19th century women's rights advocates, but actually to women too. Not just physically harmful, but really like that it would, you know, kind of enable the what they already saw as the unequal playing field sexually between men and women, that they would enable kind of the male to be preferred, like his sexual desire to kind of,
mhm,
always overtake the woman's desire to not have sex. And that was something that they were very concerned about. And we can certainly get to that because that's a big aspect of the book. But you asked like what changed me the most. I would say just really digging into Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and seeing her kind of moral claims that were very familiar to me in terms of really bringing together rights, duties, and virtues, and a really elevated understanding of the capacity for reason in the human being. That was fascinating to me. And also her claims that really one of the main things that is immiserating women is the lack of male chastity, and that
mhm,
women and men should be kind of put on an equal that the kind of virtues required of women, which was at that point, modesty and chastity, should also be required of men, and that the virtues assumed of men, like courage and kind of intellectual virtues, should be cultivated in women. Like that was awesome to me.
mhm,
And what's funny about it is that we didn't even live in a time when I started doing this research like we do now, where we hear all sorts of ways in which especially the far right, is kind of talking about virtues in a very similar way to the way in which, we can certainly discuss that, the way in which Wollstonecraft was kind of combating. And so now it's become even more. I mean, now I'm teaching her in a class I could talk about at Arizona State University, but I was thinking of doing an excerpt, and now I'm just going to assign the whole book because it's even more relevant now than it was, when I wrote my book in 2021. So it was really kind of reading her and then reading the work that she had done before Vindication of the Rights of Woman, including her conversation with Burke, or not conversation with Burke, her criticism of Edmund Burke, but then also moving back into her early pedagogical work. And then even, these 4 prayers she wrote, and just understanding like this was actually a religious woman. And I, at that point, had become, a serious religious person myself. And so it was then just going and spending a ton of time. I mean, I really I stalled the book by years. To the chagrin of my husband, I would say. It was like, can you write already? And I was like, no, 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 I have this whole new thing. So it was really, and reading a lot of secondary literature on her in the, that's been done in the last 20 to 30 years by serious political theorists who had begun to reread her as well, and see that there's like so much more here than people had assumed. I guess I would say people kind of assumed she was like this, radical Enlightenment liberal French revolutionary, and so there's all sorts of revisionism around her legacy. I would say that's happened really in the last 20 to 30 years that is very exciting to be, I would say, a part of, because I think she is really an incredible thinker, not the best writer, I would say. So having to, when you read her, you have to spend some time. But I think that was the most transformative part of the book for me, was just seeing that even within the history of women's rights, that really the foremost thinker, the one who intervenes first in a public way. There are other women we could talk about who are intervening in a public way, like in the 15th century with Christina Pizan, but who's making making rights claims in the modern era when rights have become something that are like their meaning is contested. That she too was, I would just say, a natural law thinker. And that was for me very exciting to see that really there could be bookends to this book, with Wollstonecraft at the beginning and Marian Glendon, also a natural law thinker, at the end, that could reconceive the whole project of and history of women's rights, but also like help us think about women's rights better today, which is what I had already been doing in terms of constitutional law. And now, because I had a political theory background from college, once I moved out of women's studies, I started studying political theory, that I could really ground all of that in a much more fulsome and, I would say, satisfactory way than the kind of grounding in radical autonomy, or at least the kind of autonomy that Ginsburg was after. And that seemed to me to be very exciting. And so the project took on I just became like excited every day to be working on this, even while having my 7th child, I might add.
Wow.
So it was, a very exciting project to be engaged in. And
We're so glad that you took it on. And actually, that leads right into the next question. As a wife and mother, how did your lived experience shape the questions you were asking about feminism and human dignity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, after I went to graduate school, so, leaving Middlebury, I guess, finishing off that, like, how did I move from being this kind of hardcore feminist to wanting to go study Catholic theology as a graduate student? And it's kind of a long story, but, it was very, first and foremost, with going to argue with a member of the Catholic worker movement over a talk about his, recovery from drug addiction that he was giving during this big month-long religion symposium at Middlebury, to then becoming friends with Christians on campus who were like bringing me A Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and convincing me to take a Bible class in which I basically argued with the liberal Protestant, because knowing nothing about anything really, because I was reading Jesus for the first time, and he to my heart, like, was speaking with authority because
Mhm.
of what I'd experienced, what AA had basically brought me out of, that I knew that, to live as he, suggested or commanded we ought, which is, to really be docile to God and the love that he has for us, but then also to serve others. Like, those two things are basically like the AA program. But then, of course, to take stock of our own lives and to kind of put them in order as God would have them be. Like, this is all just basically like I've been habituated, not by my own upbringing necessarily, although I did learn very many important things from my own parents, but I'd been habituated for like 5 years through AA to really learn, get out of yourself and think about another, stop taking your psychic temperature and think about another. Like, these are really important things that had literally helped me to become a person of much more emotional stability, much more kind of joy, someone who is flourishing in life much more than I had been. And so all of that led me to want to, like, well, there was a Catholic conversion in there. And I guess, I mean, I'll just say that it was really through having the great providential, I don't know, gift of having this incredible priest who I would come to learn, to learn of more through spending time with the Christians on campus. The Catholic priest is now the Bishop of Vermont, but he
Wow.
became someone who just, guided me. It was funny. I went to some Protestant churches and I never quite felt like they were right for me. And it wasn't until I went back to the Catholic Church, which actually had been the church of my baptism, and he guided me through the Catechism of the Catholic Church and had a political theory background himself. So I was studying political theory. I was studying, kind of questions of the Christian intellectual tradition with this really learned man. That those two made me really wanting more by the time I became a senior. And I actually, was sent to study with a particular theologian at Boston College by a political theorist, a Catholic political theorist who had come to Middlebury to teach for one semester, who is now a friend still. And he just said, "I think that you'd be most happy studying with this priest, this Father Ernest Fortin, who is both a political theorist of great kind of renown." I mean, in some sense, he what a loss of these great, scholars who have like all of the Western political canon in their minds. But anyway, who, had a beautiful Catholic faith, but also had political theory and had that the Western tradition in his very mind. And so I got to, sit at his feet for a couple of years. So that doesn't get us to the question of motherhood. I then went to law school, and kind of fell in love along the way. I mean, in itself is a very long, fun story about how I met my really wonderful husband. But then I got married in my second year of law school and had my first child in my third year of law school, which sounds
Wow.
insane, and it really was. But because I have such a wonderful husband, it really worked out okay. And thanks be to God for my daughter, who is now 24, and is really quite a gift. And so I'm glad the timing worked out as it did. So from that point, I really became quite enamored with the idea of giving myself entirely over to my children. And so I did have, a bunch of degrees at this point, but I had children pretty quickly too. And so I would say the learning curve on my motherhood was like as steep as it could possibly get from everything you've heard. And so I really knew that if I wanted to, raise my children well, with this wonderful husband that I had, who was as fully engaged as I was, though of course he went out to work every day to bring home the bacon, to be able to take care of them. Just engaged in, like, we were both really engaged, I would say, very much equally in the desire to cultivate the virtues in our children. And so what that meant is really cultivating the virtues in ourselves. And
Mhm.
so that was a lot of work, because I had a long way to go still, and of course still do today. But I think the real joy of having children made me, I think, particularly interested in questions of how um, these other, intellectual ideas and the contribution that women as mothers and men as fathers make to children who of course then become right the become adults and we hope become responsible and happy adults, that there is clearly a formative process there
Mhm.
that ought to occur, and that it's one that takes a lot of work. And so when I read about all of these same themes in Mary Wollstonecraft's work, having been a mom by then of a very large family, I was so gratified by the way in which she understood like the work of parenthood,
Mhm.
the work of mothers, the work of fathers to be as important as she regarded them to be. I mean, she, first of all, I mean, we'll get to her thought, but the idea that that formation in the home that I was doing, as just this one mother among many, and that my husband was doing was the foundation for every public virtue seemed to me so evidently true,
Mhm.
um, in terms of, the kinds of truth telling we need to have within the economic sphere and trustworthiness. Obviously, in the political sphere too, all of this requires kind of human beings to be privately or personally virtuous. And that was something she understood very well. And so there's a way in which we were kind of simpatico. And so
Yeah.
reading her on the page was very exciting to me. And I would say we're very, just as when I read the Bible, for the first time, or I read the New Testament, I should say, for the first time, and there was like a way in which like Jesus spoke to my heart and spoke with authority. I would say here's the first um advocate of women's rights, even more so, I would say, than the early feminists whose writing is very inspiring in many ways, but who were like thinking about particular issues, whereas Wollstonecraft's thinking about the whole. It was the first time I thought, like, wow, here's a women's rights advocate. Here's an advocate for women's equal dignity, for their own cultivation of reason and the virtues, who feels simpatico to me. And that was very
Mhm.
exciting, as a political theorist myself, or someone who is a student of political theory, to find someone who had so many similar views about so many similar things was very exciting.
Mhm. Well, I want to go a little deeper into the book, and talk about. So your subtitle is "Reclaiming a Lost Vision." What vision of the human person would you say is missing from the modern feminist discourse?
Yeah, so it's almost as though, I mean, like all of liberalism, which really, I mean, modern feminism, you could say, is really based either in um, in the liberalism of John Locke, and sometimes we could even say of Thomas Hobbes. We can kind of
Mhm.
get to that in terms of his understanding of equality, or as a reaction to that in turn, but that really takes kind of modern assumptions, I would say, about liberty for granted. And a lot of those assumptions are based in kind of this mythical understanding of the human being as kind of independent. So like, equal, free, and independent in some way.
Mhm.
And there's a way in which that is a masculine articulation, because, well, the Enlightenment thinkers were men, except for, of course, Wollstonecraft. There were some other women too, but not of the prominence in terms of now we understand her as part of the Western canon, right? So and so I think this mythic understanding of individuals, that there's like the quality of individuals requires them to be kind of independent and able to stand on their 2 feet, means that there's always an assumption that equality is kind of an equal autonomy, and it's not moral agency. Like we could talk a lot about moral agency, and we should, because that was something Wollstonecraft was very concerned about. But it's this idea that we're kind of laws unto ourselves. And
Mhm.
that's not something that I would say John Locke thought, although his account is wanting in some ways. But it is a view that if you look at someone like Thomas Hobbes, who's not quite a liberal thinker, but like a proto-liberal thinker, who basically sees us as, if you think about the Christian within the Christian or Catholic context, who sees us as according to the fall, like in a fallen state, that human beings are basically bundles of desires that are shooting against each other and
Mm.
are kind of fleeting. And that for him, because we're basically bundles of desires, for whom there is no actual sunum bonum, like there's no highest good to which our reason is ordered, but there's just basically like what we call good, which is what we desire. And that those desires come out of our like lowest appetites.
Mhm.
Our desires for honors and pleasures and power and those kinds of things. And that's why he requires like the Leviathan, right? Which is the title of his book. Because if human beings are these things, which are kind of laws unto themselves, right? Of course, you need a big state in order to make sure that they don't kill each other. And for him, human equality is based on the equality that human beings have to literally kill each other. Like that's what human equality is. And he even said like women and men are equal in this way. Well, that doesn't sound quite right, right? Because everybody knows that men are stronger than women. So how could that be? Because clearly almost every man could
Right.
kill with their bare hands every woman. Obviously there are exceptions. But what he meant was by intelligence, a group of women, like one woman could go and find other women or somebody else to kill a man. So in some sense, like that's the low equality
Yeah.
that Thomas Hobbes understood that men and women have. And what's fascinating about Hobbes himself is that he said that women have just as much authority over children, which is kind of new because women, of course, bear the children, and they actually have the authority at that time to leave the child to die or to
Mhm.
take authority of the child and parent them. And in that way, he was kind of a proponent of, what we would say is infanticide at that point,
Yeah.
or proponent of like allowing it to be so. Like if she didn't have any other means of caring, that she could just, allow them to die. So there's a way in which like that's the kind of equality that I think, unfortunately, if you get it on the bare bones, we see in kind of modern feminism, is it's kind of this like equality of the rat race, right? I mentioned market
Yeah.
equality. It's like
Mhm.
it's an equality of self-preservation. Like I just need to preserve myself, and so I'll do whatever means necessary to ensure that my desires are met, and I'm my bodily needs are taken care of. But then also as it starts to grow beyond like the early moderns into someone like John Stuart Mill, who I think is the basis of a lot of modern feminism, is basically this idea that liberty is really about individuality. And it's really becomes, as we get even further and take John Stuart Mill further into kind of postmodernism, it's really about self-creation, and that there are no natural obligations. And so that's going back to Hobbes himself, is like there's nothing natural that we owe one another. And in fact, Hobbes even says that like human beings grow up as mushrooms. And so like there's nothing like this idea of inculcating or cultivating virtues, that virtues would be necessary, is for him something that's like, oh, that's just like all those old guys. He actually names Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, Cicero. They just thought about these things, but really it's all about power. And
Mm.
so the same kind of view is the one we hear in modern feminism today, is that really it's all like, my desires and what I want against, your desires and what you want. And I need to create myself and have individual autonomy, which means really being a rule unto oneself, right? Is that I kind of, when I consent to something, well, then I can have obligations, but there's nothing natural obligating me. Right. And so it's only like when I have a child, I've consented to a child. Like when I bear that child, I've consented to have that child. But anytime within the process of being pregnant, I could change my consent and decide that I want to do away with this child, right? And so only kind of contractual or consensual obligations are those that are binding on human beings. And that's a thoroughly modern approach. And it's not the one that we see in the pre-modern era, for sure, because of this idea of natural law. And it's certainly not what we see in Mary Wollstonecraft or the early women's rights advocates
Mhm.
either, who very much understood rights and obligations as interdependent on one another. Like you couldn't have rights without obligations.
Mhm. Beautifully said. And it's mind blowing to think that in this market equality, that you can just choose to kill your child in order to quote unquote have this market equality. And
Mhm.
it's crazy to think that that is what modern feminism is about, amongst other things. And I want to go back to the early feminists, and if they could all sit together, the early feminists, at today's cultural table, listen to our conversations, as you mentioned, about autonomy, sexuality, work, and motherhood, what do you think they would say?
I think they'd feel really sorry for us. I mean, just in the sense of like, you know, especially just looking at women and saying like, don't you understand um the idea of what, I would call sexual asymmetry? Like, don't you understand, and reproductive asymmetry, that men and women just by nature have like basic bodily reproductive differences, and so when men and women engage in the same sexual act, it is clearly women who have the capacity for pregnancy, right? And men who have the capacity, if they are scoundrels, to walk away from that pregnancy. And like just that basic fact that has been from time immemorial something that um, has been very burdensome to women, that they can engage in a sexual act with men, obviously by rape or force, but also by consent and in relations of love and marriage, and that a man could walk away from that. Like that's a tremendous vulnerability that women have. And so obviously, like we can look forward to contraception and abortion, which we will. But at that time, even when there were nascent, contraceptive methods, and even as abortion was becoming more safer for the mother, they still believed that the same kind of arguments they were making for women's moral equality as being in the image of God held the same for the child in the womb. And I usually have these quotes out here, but like even the most radical of the women's rights advocates, someone like Victoria Woodhull, understood that, as she says, like the rights of the fetus begin while they're in the womb.
Mm.
And she saw no difference between infanticide, taking the life of a child afterward, and abortion, taking the life of the child in the womb. Like she saw no moral difference between those two. And so it was because it was the same exact argument that was made, is that each is made in the image and likeness of God. And so we have no authority. There's no just authority to end the life of another. Right. And so they're making the same argument that basically that feminists are always making, is like, there's no just authority, right, for a man to dominate a woman or kind of oppress her in any way, harm her in any way. In the same way, the mother who is in a position of authority over the child, there's no just capacity for her to harm that child. And so it would have been sort of like just kind of amazing to them that you would want to free male sexual aggression or male sexual desire, um, to not be really constrained by the obligations that they understood that fathers owed children. And so that would be nonsensical to them. Like, so even with abortion available, even with nascent contraceptive methods available, what their answer for this asymmetry is to call men to a higher regard for their obligations within the family, to higher understanding of kind of care, right, within the family, not to free women to kind of, imitate
Mm.
men, which is basically like, because that's what modern feminism does, right? Or abortion rights feminism is, it basically says, since men can walk away from an unintentional pregnancy, like a pregnancy that they don't, want to have obligations or responsibilities for, then women, in order to be equal to men, should be able to walk away from that pregnancy too. But of course, that walking away requires an affirmative act of killing their own unborn child, right?
Mhm.
And so that kind of equality, again, is based on this equality of domination, an equality of kind of violence, rather than the kind of equality that women wanted, um, from Wollstonecraft all the way through, the mid to late 19th century was an equality of care. And that doesn't mean like men and women do the same things all the time or something like that, but it's just basically like we each have responsibilities to the child. And so, and that what they wanted instead then was something they called voluntary motherhood, which can to modern ears sometimes say, well, doesn't that mean, abortion? Well, no, it doesn't actually. What they saw as forced motherhood was basically rape. So voluntary motherhood was the ability for women, because they had this asymmetrical, both, of course, privilege of having children, which they understood was definitely a privilege. Motherhood was like a superpower for these women. But then also that they have this asymmetrical burden, that they're the ones, as Sarah Grimke put in her beautiful essay Marriage, they're the ones who, have this helpless babe, and bring it to life in their womb, but then are the ones who care for the child early on in infancy, of course, through breastfeeding, that they're the ones who should be able to say whether sex should take place, even within marriage. So that meant that they were pushing back against this idea that a man owned his wife's body in marriage such that he could force sex upon her or assume sex even when she was not willing, or not willing to basically have a child. Because for them, to engage in the act of sex was to engage in the act that potentially made them a mother. And so they didn't want to be forced to be mothers, right? They wanted to, because they understood how important it was for women to be healthy when they bear children, not to bear children in rapid succession, after one another because of the possibility of ill health for them and for the child, because they didn't want to bear children who were their fathers were abusive or alcoholic. I mean, there was all sorts of course, these are the same women who are fighting for temperance, for men to actually restrain themselves around the drink. That's the kind of thing that they would, I think, be astonished that the sexual revolution was not the revolution they wanted, which was for men to become chaste, right? Votes for women, chastity for men was one of the slogans, right? That they wanted men to be chaste, to not engage women and their wives for lust, but take them chastely, and give to each other chastely in a beautiful marriage. Um, and so for them, like to unleash, sort of lust was basically to make women incredibly vulnerable to men.
Beautifully said. And obviously, with modern feminism, it just gives men a free pass, as you mentioned, right? Just to leave, and leave the woman to care for the baby or whatever. To basically, he walks away. And so, is this what we really want with equality? It's not really, and obviously, it's not best for the wife, the mother, or the baby. So, in with the bioethical dangers, what kinds of bioethical dangers arise when autonomy becomes the primary moral lens?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And it's something that we are seeing. I mean, I don't know the bioethics realm other than kind of abortion, contraception, sexual ethics as well as you do. But I would say I think there's a way in which patient autonomy around the abortion question has really run entirely amok. And that is that there are times in which, a pregnant woman's life or serious health, like her, particular organs and things like that, are in danger from pregnancy. And there are ethical ways of, delivering the child early, even if that child might, die in the mother and the father's arms. Um, but but the problem is when doctors, and I know this on the authority of having spent a lot of time with a Harvard Medical School doctor who explained to me, who does late term abortions. I spent like 2 hours with her, explained to me the kinds of things she says to a woman who's pregnant, is that every single pregnancy is puts a woman at risk. And so you should decide at this point or any point throughout the pregnancy whether the basically risks to you outweigh the benefits of you wanting to continue with this pregnancy. And so the autonomy of the woman's kind of will and her determination that she is the one to decide whether her child lives or dies is really a kind of radical autonomy, right? That is not what medicine, which has always understood until, modern, very, very modern times, has always understood that OBGYNs have two patients, right? The mother and the child. And that their goal is to keep both the mother and the child healthy and not to pit one against the other. And so the idea that we would allow that we would give sort of the will, and I say the will because the will of the individual woman, because it's not her reason governing here. It's just the desire to be free. Because what reason requires is for us to be beholden to higher understandings, right? That it's not like we just determine our reason just determines things for ourselves. There's always kind of laws or to which we are obligating or putting our reason, kind of subordinating our reason to. And so if the idea is like, of modern autonomy is basically like my reason is subordinated to my will, which is subordinated to my desires and therefore my fears, then we've like turned the human being who ought to be ordered by according to her reason and his reason, because that's the highest principle in us, we've turned them upside down and we've made them akin to animals, right? Because, of course, animals, unlike human beings, just as sentient beings, just go after the thing based on their desires, right? There's no kind of thinking through, making choices with their freedom and making moral decisions. And so it's really a question of like, what's the moral architecture and understanding of the human being that is animating how we think about medicine, how we think about bioethics, and the one that puts, the human desires, human wills, human fears ahead of reason is one which is not only inhumane but has become reduced us to akin as animals, which kind of, I mean, you see, because right there's all, I mean, animal rights is fine and good, for our own sake. Like we ought not, because it's bad for us to be like horribly violative of animals if we don't need them for food and things like that, right? But to treat ourselves as animals or as like on an equality with animals because really we're just desirous and fearful and all that too, that's a real kind of reduction of the great kind of dignity to which human beings are called.
Hmm. And on the flip side, Wollstonecraft's understanding of human dignity differs incredibly from this rights driven autonomy model. So, what would Wollstonecraft's vision be to this, and what would be the way out of this type of thinking?
Yeah, so it's a good thing that people are taking more interest in Christianity these days, because I think it's really hard to understand some of the older thinkers without really understanding the nature of Christianity. And I think, there are those who call themselves Christian today who I think are having a hard time understanding the nature of Christianity too. But um, Wollstonecraft's understanding of equal dignity, especially between men and women, but also of just the human being, including the man's great dignity, is because of being in the image and likeness of God. And so I'll just give you of one quote here. She says, "What cannot make us reverence ourselves, but a reverence for that being with a capital B, of whom we are a faint image." And she, is constantly talking about kind of that God is the source of our happiness, and that it is his reason, which is always wisdom, that we should submit to. And she's actually going after, and it's the reason why I think like reading her carefully and closely and not bringing all sorts of like presuppositions to a reading of her, like reading her and letting her teach us is so important today, because she is actually, and her time going after the voluntarists, which is basically this idea, voluntarism, which is, coming out, it's actually comes out of sort of a heresy within the Catholic the Catholic tradition, but then is very much part of kind of the debate between Protestants and Catholics, but then within Protestantism itself, is this idea that, you know, it is the voluntarists kind of believe that like you can't box God in. Like you can't say that God can only act according to his reason, because that is like basically putting your reason, your idea of what reason is, onto God, right? And they
Mhm.
would say, no, if God wanted to, he could make murder good, and he could, say that things that are true today aren't true tomorrow. And the, those who were, the Catholics were, and those like Wollstonecraft who were opposed to voluntarism would basically say, no, 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 like God is one, and his will cannot be separate from his reason, because his will is always wise. And so she
Mhm.
is really going after that. And why would it make sense that she would want to go after it as a woman who saw her like father beat up her mother, and someone who saw like all sorts of bad situations for women? Is because when you free or think of the husband's authority as being free, like it's his own will that can do whatever he wants against a woman, and it's not bound by higher
Mhm.
laws and a higher authority and God's authority, then that is going to put women in immense amount of danger. She also saw it obviously with regard to just law itself. And so she, think about the unbound king, who she was worried that like kings who have, unbound authority or too much power that isn't checked,
Mhm.
will also be liable to not do good for his subjects, but do ill for his subjects, basically tyranny. And so it's the same tyranny she's worried about, the same tyranny that the American founders were worried about, is the kind of tyranny she's worried about within marriage and then the male female relationship. She's deeply concerned with this unbound will. And she wants to ensure that human beings' dignity is very much always subordinated to or understood within the confines of being made in the image and likeness of God. And so like that opens a whole other question, right? Like what does all of that mean? But it
Mhm.
certainly doesn't mean that we can just sort of willy-nilly end the lives of human beings whenever we want. It means that human beings themselves have a very high dignity, and that one person's will should never be able to like cancel out another person's life, which is of course what the idea of putting personal autonomy in the hands of one person such that they can end the life of another in an unjust way, not talking about self-defense or
Mhm.
other kinds of things like that, is really, as my friend Carl Truman has just written a book that will be coming out soon, is a desecration of man, because it is undermining the image of God in him.
Right. And obviously, the modern understanding of freedom and autonomy does not align with human flourishing. In fact, as you said, it actually just leads to people acting out of an animalistic instinct or desire only. So let's look at what it means to have this kind of autonomy that's checked, basically balancing rights and responsibilities. So, why is a responsibility based framework essential for women's rights? And how does it change the ethical conversations?
Yeah. So I think that it's you could say it's autonomy that's checked. And I think that's a helpful way to put it, because it's not like people don't have autonomy at all. So there's like this radical version which basically says like I have the capacity to be my own lawgiver, and that there's no other laws apart from kind of positive laws like human laws that are, confining me or giving me obligations. That in fact there are natural obligations, and the very first one that everyone will agree to, actually we'll think of two. One is the obligation to seek the truth, and that's just something that everybody sort of assumes. Like, of course, human beings ought to seek the truth, right? And that's because we're rational. We're rational beings. And so we ought to seek the truth as best we can, right? And we do, and we try to. And then the second one that's very obvious to most people is that parents owe obligations, natural obligations to their children. So, if there weren't, like, if there were a kind of corrupt government that decided to like pull down all the laws that said parents owe obligations to their children, we would still say that parents owe obligations to their children. So what is that? Why? Because they're natural obligations, right? And so like why is that so? Well, it's because there's some natural law, there's some natural ordering that is part of our reason, right? And so the virtues that we've talked about a couple of times help us cultivate and free our reason to allow us to carry out these obligations that reason kind of offers to us, right? And so if I'm, fearful, if I lack courage, well, I need to cultivate that courage so that I can carry out the obligations I have in my life in all sorts of other ways, right? And so those responsibilities are just baked into what it is to be a human being. And especially in terms of like, parental rights and duties, they've just always been assumed to be baked into that understanding of being a parent, being a mother or father. It's not something like we've just created, because, oh, we're so smart as human beings. No, no, no. They come with kind of being a human being, that we have this sense, unless we're like corrupted and made into, kind of, well, desecrated or degraded into these animal beings who just kind of like raise our children like wolves, right? Or mushrooms, as Hobbes would say, that we actually owe these duties to our children, and that we owe duties of care to one another. And there is a way in which that's new in terms of Christianity, because what Christianity does is say, we don't only owe duties because of some like, Roman hierarchy, right? Where you could think about like, the paterfamilias in Roman law could just, that's the father of the family had absolute authority over his children and his wife. So he could just determine whether his child lives or dies, or the kind of slavish behavior that his wife would have to, have with him. When Christianity comes, says, no, 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 everybody's made in the image and likeness of God, and it raises up even the weakest and the most vulnerable, and gives them, it recognizes in them a human dignity because they are made in the image and likeness of God. And so you could think of like the early Christians who were, out saving children who had been left, infants who had been left and exposed. They were holding up the beauty of motherhood, and of course, because of Mary, but also that children ought to be, no matter whether they're a boy or a girl, or no matter whether they're sickly or not, that they should be cared for because of this great dignity they have, because we owe responsibilities to one another, because we are humans. And that's what being human in a Christian understanding is.
Mhm.
And so the responsibilities approach is always kind of asking, like, what do I owe? Instead of saying, like, what do I feel? What are my fleeting desires make my will sort of want to do? It's saying, no, 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 no. Like, what do I owe? And when I owe that, how can I get help from my community? Because my community owes me help in some sense, because we're all like connected, right? But that also, how can I cultivate the kind of powers of intellect, the moral powers, to be a true agent? And so this is where I like the language of moral agency a bit better than autonomy, because it's being an agent of my own life, where again, reason governs my actions, and then I'm fully free. Whereas, we can say that bodily autonomy is something that we agree with insofar as, or that bioethics could agree with insofar as we say that one person cannot kind of own another person in terms of either slavery or in terms of making decisions for another person's body. I mean, so bodily autonomy is something that in the common law is basically a way that like you can't be like assaulted by another, right? But that's a separate question, right? That like my person has integrity and shouldn't be assaulted or made to do something, right, against my will. Like, I don't know, you could think about like the bioethical questions of, requiring someone to give bone marrow or something like that. Like that's would be an assault on someone's autonomy. But a person has moral agency to make a determination whether I am responsible for another and therefore ought to give bone marrow, right? And so those are kind of the ways in which you think differently. You don't first think about rights, you first think about my responsibilities. And of course, underlying responsibilities to the other is because they have the dignity of one who is a creature of God, is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore has the right not to have things happen to them, right? So therefore, rights and responsibilities are always correlative. There's another way in which, let me just say, finish saying this, because there's different ways in which rights and responsibilities are correlative. One, as I say, is like being, if someone else has responsibilities to me, therefore I have a claim on them, I have a right, right? But then there's a way in which responsibilities also rights also enable responsibilities, right? So if I have a responsibility to worship God or glorify God or seek the truth or any of these kinds of things that are responsibilities of being human, therefore I ought to have the freedom to do so, right? I ought not have like the state tell me what to think. And I ought to have the right to learn, right? I ought to have a right of some kind of education in order, if I'm going to have to fulfill my responsibility as a human being, to seek the truth. And those were the kind of arguments that Wollstonecraft was making for women's education, because, as she said, if women have human souls, then they, like men, have the same means of, cultivating virtue and becoming moral agents, which is, to cultivate their reason. And so you can't just assume, as she says at the very beginning in the preface, you can't just assume you can coerce them to carry out their duties of motherhood or within marriage or, their duties as human beings. You can't coerce them to do so. They have to understand that it is in keeping with their good. And the way they do that is by cultivating the virtues. And so that's what she's really concerned with.
Right. And the way that I've been taught this is to talk about, well, when we follow the rights and responsibilities model, that actually is what makes us happiest, and leads to human flourishing, because it's a freedom for excellence, as Pink Hairs would
That's right.
say, as opposed to freedom from something. And I'll just give the example: we have the freedom to just bang on a piano, but does that make beautiful music? No. It's when we follow the laws of music that we can create beautiful music. And in the same way, when humans act according to the rights and responsibilities they have, they can create that beautiful melody, versus just what modern feminism is, which is just banging on the piano, making some really loud sound, but it's not music, right? I think that the rights and responsibilities aspect is something that really needs to come back, because it's actually what will make us flourish and make for that beautiful music that we want.
Yeah, Rita, can I add something to that? I think I too love like the when you watch a soccer team play, you see like they had to work really hard to, I'm a big soccer fan. So they had to work really hard to be able to pass like this. I mean, for anyone who's even tried to like juggle or pass a soccer ball, like to be able to have the freedom to allow their body, their legs and their entire body to be able to pass in such a way that it looks like, when you see beautiful like Olympic level soccer, that's really hard to do, just like being in an orchestra, just like piano or ballet or any of these kinds of things. Like you enter into a practice and you learn the rules of that practice. You learn kind of the virtues in some sense of that practice. And that's what it is to be a human being too, is like, why wouldn't we also wonder if we admire all these excellences in other aspects of life, is there a way to be excellent as a human being too? And we would say, yes, that's the cultivation of virtues. That's what the great Aristotelian tradition. And I just want to add one thing, because I think the way you put it was helpful, is that that's a freedom for excellence and not a freedom from. And I wouldn't want to just add the part about freedom from, because there is a freedom from as well. And that's why rights are important. So like a freedom for excellence is, taking up the responsibilities we have to become excellent as the dignified human beings we are. But there's a way in which freedom from is still important too. I mean, and that's like freedom from oppression or freedom from being kind of subordinated by another or being harmed by another. And so, of course, like those two things need to be held together. And that's what I think Wollstonecraft also does really well. So if you want to, like pull a line from her, you'll say, well, she's all about freedom from oppression. Like, yes. Well, and then you can try to pull a line from it and say, well, she's all about freedom from excellence, for excellence. Yes. But these two things are held together. they're also held together really well in Catholic social teaching. And that's why rights and responsibilities are together. So we don't want to just say we only have responsibilities, we only have duties, because that would assume that we could just be then all those duties could be kind of imposed on us in a way that is violent, right? But actually, because we are human beings, we have rights to carry out those responsibilities and rights not to be oppressed, right, by some sort of like tyrannical force, whether it's, you know, a government, most obviously, or by, in the case of a vulnerable woman, by a man.
Hmm. I want to now turn to the sexual revolution. Obviously, that has had many ramifications on our culture. So, what would you say are the biggest costs of this autonomy centered feminism and the sexual revolution on women, on children, on society, on men too?
Well, that's a long laundry list. Yeah, I mean, the thing I would say, to get back to the insight of those early women's rights advocates, is, and it's an insight of theirs that I think is we can use economic language for, is this idea of moral hazard. And so what happens when you introduce, so the basic idea of moral hazard is when you introduce any type of technology into kind of a human activity, it basically disenables or tends to reduce the necessity for the human being to cultivate the virtues needed to carry out that activity, right? Or in the case of just like a seatbelt, which we can say is a moral hazard, but is something that where the costs outweigh the benefits, is that, or like straight lines on the side of a road, right? Or even, that basically like those require the human being to drive more safely. If they weren't there, they'd have to be really safe, right? Well, we say, okay, with regard to the safety of a seatbelt, we'll take the safety of the seatbelt, even if it allows like teenage boys to drive really fast, thinking the seatbelt will save me, right? So in the
Mhm.
same way, the contraceptive pill, especially because it is highly effective in terms of preventing pregnancy, though not fully effective, it's a moral hazard. And it basically, instead of requiring, as all of human history in a Christian context required men and women to engage in chaste sexual relations, that is, to subordinate their animalistic instincts to their reason, and therefore to healthily integrate all of the reasons one has sex together with, with the kind of highest ones basically subordinating the others. So sexual pleasure is definitely a good, but always has to be both integrated to and then subordinated to the reasons one has sex. And what are those reasons? Well, obviously for the unity of the couple and for the potential of procreation. When you basically say you have contraception, you assume it kind of gives people the sense that sexual acts will always be kind of presumptively sterile, right? And so there's this idea that then we can have all sorts of sex, right? Because we won't have babies that go with that sex. And when the sexual revolution moves for now 50, 60 years, there's a presumption that sex isn't even for babies anymore. In
Mhm.
fact, well, you probably know this better than I do, but some of the, people who are really working on reproductive technologies are saying, well, sex is for pleasure and science is for babies. And really, we'll just work off the babies thing in the, in vitro fertilization. We'll be able to decide which babies are the healthiest in some eugenic sense. And then we'll, maybe hopefully get these, artificial wombs. And in the meantime, we'll just use women as kind of these canisters or vessels for
Mhm.
holding the babies while they grow up. But really, we're the ones who, figure this all out. And then pleasure can go, since we have this other technology of contraception and abortion, we could just let pleasure rip, right? Of course, the problem with that, as we talked about, in the ways in which there are asymmetries in sexual desire, but also asymmetries in strength between men and women, so that women's, you know, sexual desire, which, as the great John Paul II talked about, takes a lot longer to mature in a relationship
Mhm.
and also in an actual sexual act, that it takes immense patience of her husband who loves her. It takes immense trusting in that man, to allow her to have any sexual pleasure, really.
Mhm.
um, right? But then there's this moral hazard that just means that we've forgotten all about the cultivating of the virtues that require us to actually, elevate, as Wollstonecraft talks about, elevating the sexual act from the animalistic one to a truly human one. And she even says to the parental one that it actually is a parental act, right? Is an act that potentially makes us parents. And so when you have technology intervening in all that, you forget all that. So then what comes from that? Well, that's the sexual revolution, right? When you basically, the way I articulated in The Rights of Women is you take technology to solve the problems of asymmetry as kind of the cure of asymmetry. So the technology of the birth control bill, of abortion, of then, of course, of IVF, of surrogacy, of all these kinds of technologies. And instead of the moral and legal to some extent, right, solutions to sexual asymmetry. By solutions, I don't mean cures, because you can't change the fact that men and women have these asymmetries, right? But you can say that instead we'll require legally, but then we'll assume and ask morally that men could actually be the great, gentlemen and not impose themselves on women. As the sexual revolution kind of assumes that, you assume that you kind of opt out of sex, right? And that sex is just something that's assumed in casual sex culture. And we see now that most people are pretty, I don't know, not don't think it's the best way to go anymore. So there's a lot of fallout from the sexual revolution.
Mhm.
Thankfully, there's many more people who are starting to recognize this and starting to kind of put the pieces together and see that it really begins with the pill.
Right, and there's plenty of people who, even without any religious background, who are choosing to abstain because they don't want to give in to, just being used by a guy over and over again and thrown out essentially. And so they're coming to this for even just from a secular perspective. What about vulnerabilities? So bioethics has a recognition that there is vulnerability and that we are also dependent on other people. So how do we see this not as a weakness, but as an integral part of human life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just so basic to the pre-modern account of what it is to be human that we
Mhm.
aren't these kind of autonomous individuals who kind of grow up like mushrooms or are, mature individuals as independent men, but actually we are come into the world as babies, as infants, as helpless infants, and that we require others always. Every person requires some sort of family, whether it's a good family or a bad family. We always require people to nourish us. If we live to adulthood, it's because there's been other people who have cared for us and nourished us. And then at all instances between our birth and our death, when all of that becomes necessary again, like our old age, right? When we become very, very highly dependent on the care of others, there's all sorts of instances too in, throughout life when we are sick. I've been sick for like 10 days now. When we kind of have to take it easy, right? Or others have to care for us. And so that dependency and care is just so constitutive of who is we are as human beings. As Aristotle said, like only, a beast or a god is kind of can be on his own because everybody requires others to care for them. And so it's really thinking about how to do that in a way that's in keeping with human dignity of both men and women, but it ought to be something that is understood as just part and parcel of being human, whether a man or a woman or a child.
Yeah, no man is an island. We are all dependent on each other, as you
Hmm.
said, from even pre-birth to all the way till
That's right.
we die. I want to talk a little bit about motherhood in particular. And modern culture says that motherhood limits women. You argue that it frees women. Can you unpack that?
That's interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, to say that motherhood frees women requires us to talk a whole bunch about freedom, right? But I think there is a way in which becoming a mother really frees one of this kind of market mentality that has kind of taken over our society, or the thought that the only value I have is my productivity. The only value I have is kind of the way I contribute to the bottom line or to the country's GDP. And when you have children and you become a mother, that all kind of like gets thrown out of the window. Not because people aren't still saying that, they are, but because you recognize how important you are in the life of this totally helpless baby. And that in itself changes you because you begin to, even though there are times when you like can be like, oh my gosh, this is too much, there is something that is transformative in um, that helpless baby's call for you in particular, and the way in which you in particular can really nurture and care for that baby. And then as the baby grows, can kind of educate and nourish their intellect and strengthen their will, and help them to become virtuous people, who are capable of great friendship. And like this kind of, from nurture and care to human formation is just such a beautiful, as someone who, does this a lot is my main gig, with my own family. It's just something that is so beautiful that I think it really frees us to understand life through a much more, I would say, transcendent horizon, but a horizon that is far beyond living just for the next, I don't know, thrill, or doing my job so I can get my paycheck so I can travel more. Or like it's that's a very small life.
Mhm.
And I know that's hard for people to understand. It's almost like the chasm between not being a mother and being a mother, unless you've been in a family like mine where there's like lots of babies around and there's, as we say, like high status. Motherhood is of high status in my family because it's so cool. Like everybody thinks it's so cool that like, wow, like you're a person who can have a human being, an eternal soul in your body, right? Like how cool is that? Yeah, I just think like that chasm of moving from not a mother to a mother is just one that you can't describe. I mean, I think, the greatest, I guess, artists and movie makers and poets um and novelists maybe could attempt at it, but it really is an experience that just has to be experienced for oneself. And I mean, to my mind, it's so sad that so many women, for whatever reason today, young women, for whatever reason today, are thinking that they're going to opt out of that. I mean, could it be because they haven't had, fallen in love? They don't have men around them that they feel like they can really put in their trust and entrust themselves to, because of course that's what one must do to have a child, is to really entrust yourself to a man if you're a woman. And that's a hard thing. Like you've got to find a man who's trustworthy, right? And that takes time. And there's a lot of bad forces in our culture right now, that I think are making the formation of both men and women, deforming kind of men and women, so that they're not capable of that great kind of giving of self, that you have to do, right? But yeah, I mean, I do think it's been something that has been also made me a better thinker. There's no question about that, a deeper thinker. And I've heard other mothers say that too, who, aren't Catholics, aren't necessarily religious, that they are capable of just seeing, I guess, seeing the whole better, like where we fit into the universe in a way that gets them, kind of jolts them from their idea of like, I'm just this autonomous being who goes around and works and spends my money on things.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that with the sexual revolution, with men and women opting out of responsibility or even that greater virtue, it's even harder to find a spouse, just because people have gotten used to living that kind of life where it's more animalistic, more about what's in it for me, and not about the gift of self. Truly. So, what will it take to bring culture's understanding of motherhood up? And obviously, right now, motherhood is undervalued in culture, unfortunately, and caregiving is undervalued. So, what will it take for that to turn around?
Well, certainly not the discourse we have right now. So I think, sadly, there's this idea, like, on the political right, that if you just, like, shame progressive women enough, like, they'll wanna become mothers or something, and I just think, like, did anybody think that through? I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of resentment that, there's, men who are resentful about a whole bunch of things in our society, which they probably ought to be resentful about. And so I do think there's a way in which, though, the political discourse on, I would say, the far right is making it worse for women to think that they'll ever be a trustworthy man. And I think that that's a really important point that I think people don't tend to understand. I think men particularly don't understand because they don't live as women, right? That the kind of vulnerability that women have in first in sex, but then also in bearing a child is really robust, right?
Mhm.
Um, so, you can imagine like there's a woman next to you and she's a lawyer and you're a lawyer and isn't it great? She's really smart and, she has all these degrees and she can take care of herself, certainly, and she I don't know, just doesn't seem vulnerable at all. You're like, yeah, great. And then you recognize like, oh my gosh, but our bodies make us entirely different, right? In the sexual act and in the reproductive experience. And it's hard for women to admit to that because historically it has been the case that by, talking about the vulnerability and actual dependency that women have, that mothers have on the father of their child, or, that they think that means it's going to, disassemble all the things that have happened between when women were considered like just basically child bearers,
Mhm.
prior to Christianity, right? Um, and we're gonna kind of lose the gains we've gotten in terms of really being understood as the equals of men intellectually, professionally, etc. And so, that makes sense because literally those kinds of voices are coming back on the right. And so I think sadly, if you're just a woman who doesn't know about political discourse and doesn't know a lot of, say, conservative pro-life men, you might think that all men who think that women ought not be able to kill their child think like those men, like a
Mhm.
Nick Fuentes or something. And that's just nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the kinds of men I know personally, professionally, are incredible gentlemen, who relish their friendships with women, who have great admiration for the intellects of women within conservatism itself. And so that I think is a real worry and concern I have, is that that some people on the far right are making things worse on the far left. And it wouldn't even be the far left. I mean, really, it's like the mainstream. Well, maybe the far
Mhm.
left has just taken over the mainstream left. I'm not sure. But in terms of like the kinds of articles that have been written, well, for a long time, but have become like more and more mainstream in the New York Times, the Atlantic, of how like motherhood ruins everything, about the kind of dangers that we talked about before of every single pregnancy, that
Mhm.
pregnancy is just like a dangerous thing. I mean, this is causing women to fear pregnancy in very high numbers. Pregnancies are already scary. It's like totally scary, right? So why would
Mhm.
we add to that? And so I think like that's deeply unfortunate. And the other thing I would say is like because I have a lot of kind of alliances and conversations with more progressive women. I call myself center right, with center left women who deeply, they have great, they're brilliant, have professional achievements and all that, but they have deep, deep regard for their husband. They love being mothers, and they don't say that enough. And the reason, I've heard one in particular told me that she doesn't want to say that because she thinks it's gloating. And I'm like, "No, you need to
We
say it.
need to hear that.
We need to hear it." Yeah, and I think that that's really important, is just how, not only how beautiful motherhood is in the ways that I've spoken about, but the beautiful way in which a man and a woman together in a family can work together in raising children in a really collaborative, beautiful way. And I think that that's a part that, I'm actually working on a book on all of this right now because I think it's really important that we do need more models of how one could kind of live in the world and contribute to the world, with one's kind of gifts, intellectual gifts or otherwise. And I think there's kind of a kaleidoscope of ways in which you could do that. It's not kind of one way or the other, which is, I think, the way that we're kind of given to believe in our discourse today, which I think is it's unfortunate that so many people have access, I think, to social media. And so this is what they think is true about the world, where it's like, turn it all off and go meet some people, especially in your church, probably, and ask them how they have such a happy marriage, how their children have become such wonderful people. Like those are the people you want to talk to figure it all out, you know.
Well, when you finish that book, I would love to have you back to talk all about that because it is so pertinent to our culture today. But I think that to the point that you were making that women are afraid of kind of falling back into pre-feminist era, being treated that way culturally, and being afraid of motherhood for that reason, or even being afraid to be vulnerable um, with a man. How can we create a space in our current modern culture where we can support motherhood and the caregiving roles, but without falling back into those old stereotypes or sexist generalizations?
Yes. Well, I mean, again, I think that we were onto something, I guess, in the 90s, but um, I think that this isn't so hard. Um, because I think we just have to make some careful distinctions. And I think really the best way to do that, I think, is the kind of distinctions that Edith Stein makes, of course, the German and then Jewish Catholic philosopher of I guess the last century, early in the last century, um, in terms of just holding three things together. And I do this in a piece I wrote for First Things called Sex Realist Feminism. But it's basically like we are human beings, which means certain things, that we are rational creatures who are ordered to excellence. We are also, at the very same time, sexually dimorphic, which means we are male and female. And that means that we have like large and small gametes. It means that we, reproduce inside ourselves or outside of ourselves, depending on whether we're male or female. And then we are also individual. And all of those things need to be held together in kind of attention. And whenever there's a way in which one takes precedence over the other, and so such that it like either subordinates the other or negates the other, then we're on the wrong track. And so you could think of places where, I mean, I would want to call them heresies, but you would you
You
could
can
think of
call them that.
places, yeah, you could think of places where one of those three dimensions of being human is just pushed way beyond the others. And so I would say that, the sexually dimorphic one, right? The one where women are the ones who have the capacity for bearing a child, men are the ones who have the capacity for like siring a child, right? So for inseminating a woman, therefore being the father of the child, that those were sort of made to kind of undermine the other two before in kind of prior times, you might say, so that that women's whole of life was taken up by her capacity for motherhood, and she was kept out of kind of rational engagements. Not that she wasn't being rational in her own home, of course, but that, she wasn't seen as kind of fit for um intellectual professional work, that there was a way in which somehow her reason was less than men's because she had this capacity for motherhood. And I think that except for again on the far right, has been totally dispensed with. That we just look around and we see that women have great capacity for reason. Then also this individual one, which really, as a Catholic, makes a lot of sense to me in terms of like vocational discernment, is
Mhm.
that again not undermining the other two. So we shouldn't, I think that we can discern as an individual that I should be a prostitute because or even a surrogate, because I think those undermine both the other two, like a rational regard for what it is to be a human, and then what it is to be a woman are undermined by that pursuit. But within kind of just and lawful pursuits, it is a kind of a question of like, how do I hold these things together as a woman? And then as a mother, how do I hold these things together? And I do think when you're a mother of young children, there is a particular responsibility you have to those young children. That means, especially if you have, because of your personal circumstances and financial circumstances, that your husband has to have a really big job, right? So there may be ways, and that you feel very called to kind of the work of the home or really spending time in their children's day-to-day lives, not only called, but responsible for their upbringing. But are there ways in which you can still be exercising all sorts of, you know, rational capacity, intellectual work outside of the confines of motherhood? I think absolutely, right? And depending on financial need, and each woman's aptitudes and capacities and all sorts of things, that could be from a very small amount of work or could be from a great deal of work, right? Depending on what other who else she can bring into her life to help
Mhm.
carry out that caregiving with her, and including her husband, especially if he's works from home or is able to work less than a 40-hour week depending on his own work. I mean, all sorts of like professors do this, right? Where they have a lot of flexibility. Other people who have kind of night shifts. And then you just think about some women and some families are not able in our economic situation to have anyone who is kind of prioritizing the children because they both have to just make ends meet. And that's a really hard situation. I think that we ought to be really thinking hard about how to make changes, so that a mother and a father can think with their own kind of family autonomy, like to think about like how it is that they can make decisions about their own family that would be best for both the mother and the father, and especially the children who they are, have real responsibilities to nurture and care for and educate.
And to your point, my next question is about, well, how can we create that human-centered workplace and economy? What does that look like? One that actually serves women and families.
Yeah, so I think a really important part in terms of both like linking back your last question in terms of stereotypes and all of that is that I am a big believer that anti-discrimination law is really important and an important safeguard for the family's work, not taken to the extent that like the Biden administration does,
Mhm.
or in some sense where we look, at a company and say, as Title VII can do in terms of disparate impact harm, where like, oh, if there aren't enough of one sex or another, that there must be some sort of discrimination here, and that's obviously a harder kind of claim to make than just intentional discrimination. But I do think that companies shouldn't intentionally discriminate against women or as those with the capacity for childbearing or mothers for a number of really important reasons. One is that we don't know the situation at all of that family. We don't know how much that family has to rely on the mother's income. We don't know about the nature of her husband or if she has a husband. We don't know about in the very first case of Title VII that allowed for a mother to be considered or said that you shouldn't discriminate against women. She had 7 kids and her husband was a drunk and she had to go out and make the money and get the insurance for taking care of the children. Like, we just don't know the situation of women. We don't know situations in which she actually needs to be the primary caregiver or sorry, primary breadwinner for the family. Because of other kinds of things having nothing to do with the father lacking responsibility, but because he's an artist, because he has other reasons, disabilities, etc. Who knows? And so I think it's really important not to discriminate against women, so that or against caregivers, so that the family can organize their life as they see fit.
Mhm.
And I think just to kind of have some trust in families that they tend to, if they can, if they're free to do what's best in the lives of their children, assuming that there's not this like really strong cultural messaging that says every child needs to be put into daycare, which I think is because of this idea of market equality. Obviously, that's something that is imposing a lot of weight on families' decisions. But I think if you were freed from that, that there would be a way in which anti-discrimination law, in its most basic kind, would make a lot of sense. And then in terms of there's also ways in which the state, I think, owes a lot to families for all the
Mhm.
obvious reasons, because families are doing really hard work, but also to ensure that like the tax code does not discriminate in any way, so that parents are actually economically um, made worse off than say you have 5 kids, so you have a parent, two parents, five kids, and you're worse off economically than seven guys living together, right? Like there
Mhm.
has to be a way in which in the tax code that the family is, not kind of dragged down by taxes or by other kinds of burdens, because the kind of work parents are doing is, you know, not only creating taxpayers, which is kind of a really, just economic way of thinking about it, but also creating, crafting and cultivating friends and citizens and all of those really important things, work that the family does. So I think that that's really important, whether it's, through tax credits, et cetera.
Right to your point, so what kind of legal reforms would you believe would be most helpful to encouraging and be most helpful for women and families to flourish?
Yeah, so I was gonna go on to talk about just like the workplace, the requirements or the real demands on the workplace, which I think is really important. And so, the reforms there, I think, would put me a little bit out of my own expertise in terms of thinking about employment law, um, and the kind of things that we can kind of burden businesses to do, but like what can and cannot be done in some sense right now. But I do think, that putting a lot of moral, weight on or moral, persuasion on companies to think not so much about, the diversity of their workplace in terms of diversity of race or diversity of men and women or something like that, but think about, really having family-friendly workplaces, so that people can really take up their caregiving and see that as really the most important part of their work, that they do as a human being. And so these kinds of things are kept in a little bit more harmony, and that can, people like other workers can get really resentful of that. So maybe it's just flexibility overall, that there should be ways in which if you're getting your work done, that, it may be that you, have to care for your grandmother sometime, and then you want to use that time to do that. But like it's allowing for the possibility that human beings are not just like cogs and machines, but actually ought to be caring for other human beings. Hopefully, especially children, but also ailing spouses, ailing friends who, all those kinds of things. I think just having more flexibility in the workplace would be good. In terms of legal reforms, I think, I'd have to, think about, there are certainly reforms to anti-discrimination law that I think are important. I was mentioning disparate impact. I think that that's probably not so helpful when it comes to sexual discrimination, because there are plenty of women who make decisions that don't have anything to do with, being discriminated, but it's just they've just chosen to work less or something like that. So it's really, requiring intent, I think, is important there, um, for the most part. I, do think that reforms to the tax code are probably the most important place where you could see that, are we disincentivizing people from getting married? I think the answer is yes. Are there kind of, cliffs in which like someone makes state-based, healthcare and that kind of thing that falls off once they start making too much money? And those kinds of questions, I would just say I trust greatly my EPPC colleague Patrick Brown, and really, try to think through those kinds of questions.
And I think too, that COVID-19, I mean, maybe the only silver lining I've seen in that is just the flexibility that it has brought to women, to families, that you can work remotely, or even partially remotely, and still be able to care for your children, family, as you said, ailing members of the family or friends. So I think that, yeah, creating workplace flexibility actually opens the door and makes not only marriage and family possible, but really, as you said, that we're participating in the greatest act, right, which is the raising of children. One quote that I'm sure you've heard before, but the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, or the quote from, I forgot the archbishop's name, who basically said, you're not responsible for building the cathedral, the Notre Dame cathedral, but you're building actually the body of a human being, and nourishing that soul. And so there's that transcendent value, and hopefully we can see some more of that being honored and respected with the kinds of policies and workplace policies that there are. But what about with regards to marriage? Obviously, a stable marriage is indispensable for women's flourishing, but also for children's flourishing and for men too. So, how do we rebuild a marriage culture that supports and not isolates women?
Yeah, I mean, supports and not isolates. I mean, that's hard because that is, I think, something that's really serious in terms of women feeling isolated in neighborhoods, especially when they're home with children. And it harkens back to, Betty Friedan's the problem that has no name, like women just literally feeling isolated in their new like suburban homes where, what were they to do but like wash the floor 3 times a day or whatever. I think that isolation is really hard for women, especially if they live in remote places, and that you really do need to, as I'm sure you know well, is like you do have to take it upon yourselves to, enter into a community of other parents who are, raising their children as you are. I've been amazed by the school community around us, the school communities around us. One of the schools is one I helped to found about 13 years ago. St. Benedict Classical Academy, which started with 25 kids, now has like 350. And it's amazing. Like when we were founding the school, it didn't occur to us really that, like, oh, you should go out and build community. It was like, no, we're actually trying to just educate children. But what's been beautiful byproduct of all that is really building a robust Catholic community in the
Mhm.
Boston area where people are trying to move to the area in order to like raise their children in this beautiful community. So I'm so happy for the younger moms who and the younger dads who are very much feel so edified by that community. I think that's really, really beautiful. In terms of marriage, I mean, obviously, in that realm, there's like all sorts of potential reforms where, there's kind of these ideas of covenant marriage where you're thinking out more clearly what it is you're doing when you're entering a marriage and therefore not exiting it quite so quickly and easily. There is a way in which you can exit a marriage in our country, like kind of it's easier than exiting a business partnership. And
Right.
so thinking about especially children and uh, the kind of responsibilities that we ought to have to children and how good marriage is for children, I think is really important. I think we've seen all sorts of data recently on this. Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege. So I'm hoping, I mean, again, the way in which so much more evidence is coming forth to show this really beautiful, like collaborative way of raising children is so good for them and so good for their parents. And so to my mind, one great thing would be to like have the people on the far right who are like assuming that, marriage is this, I don't know, like hierarchy of unequals where, the wife just has to listen to everything the man says and obey him in every single way, and just this like kind of like oppressive situation is being hailed by these guys. And I think it's unfortunate because we live in a time where like marriage has crumbled so much. There's so many beautiful voices, such great marriage ministry, so many beautiful marriages and beautiful families that live with great collaboration between men and women, that I would hate to see like that, the kind of awful noises on the far right to in any way impact people's decision to get, especially women's decision to get married. That would be, I think, a real loss right now.
Do you see signs that a virtue centered feminism is reemerging among younger women today?
I think so. I mean, in terms of virtue centered, I mean, if we understand virtue properly, right? I mean, I think there's this idea of the virtues are excellences of the human being. And so, is there a way in which feminism, we haven't defined feminism as I define it. So that's probably important. But just the idea of advocacy for women as equal in dignity, advocacy for women's special kind of interests. That I think is kind of perennially needed because of women's vulnerability and the ways in which, as a Catholic, sin or basically that kind of dominance between men and women can really infect relationships. That I think the need for women to kind of come together for to advocate for women who don't have like kind of the kind of marriage I have is I think always going to be always needed. And so what's that advocacy for? Well, again, it's not for radical autonomy, but for excellence, right? To become kind of flourishing human beings, to have flourishing friendships and flourishing marriages and flourishing, become flourishing mothers and fathers, and flourishing in whatever aspect is your vocational call, whether it's home with children as a mother and a homemaker, whether it's doing that as well as doing other things, whether it's being a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer, being out in the public square, whether it's being, all of these kinds of things. I think when we think about them as human excellences, where we can bring to bear on whatever work we do, whether it's work that's for pay, work that's in the home, caregiving work, all of those different kinds of work are the real provide real fodder or the environment for cultivating the excellences in ourselves and others. And so I think that's great and something that that we ought to pursue, and many women are pursuing. Is there a way in which it's having a place more in the public square? And I'd say yes. I would also think that that's happening. I mean, first and foremost, obviously, in the journal, I edit fair disputations, so like the fairer sex, FAIRER disputations, where we have all sorts of actually debates. We've had a couple. One Catholic philosopher and a radical feminist, discussing sort of the ground of our agreement on a lot of these kinds of questions having to do with pornography, sex trafficking, surrogacy, prostitution, where radical feminists and Catholics agree, but what is the ground of that agreement? And so a really good discussion there. Another one that should be out around the time when this video comes out is a debate between a Catholic philosopher and a radical feminist on the nature of sex,
Mm.
which I think is also really good and kind of pushes on this question of the virtues. And I think a lot of it is just that we don't have the language of virtue anymore, really. Like people don't understand it. And so they think it means like, oh, a virtuous woman must mean modesty and chastity. It's like, well, yes, and all the other human virtues too. And a
Mm.
virtuous man is all the human virtues. Like, how do we cultivate them to make us into the kind of dignified, rational creatures that God has created us to be, who can, be, again, have great friendships, which I think is like one of, whether it's with God first and foremost, but then with each other, I think is a real beautiful vision of those before sort of market mentality ate up the whole of our language about what it is to be a human being, that I think we really can recover.
Mhm. And speaking of virtue, do you think that feminism is compatible with Christianity? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's implicit in pretty much everything I've said, right? That
Yeah.
an understanding of women's great dignity comes out of Christianity, right? And so there's a way in which you see this both in really holding up women in the image and likeness of God, but it's something that really had to develop throughout the Christian tradition in really understanding women as fully rational, like the rational equals of men. That's not to say that every woman is as smart as every man or has as much practical wisdom as every man or anything like that. It's just to say that as rational creatures, that women ought to have the same kind of education, say a liberal education, that a man does in order to cultivate those virtues. And I think that's something that was slow in coming and that sort of required the push of some of the early feminists, in the sense of, say, if you look at, Thomas Aquinas, who's one of my great heroes, that you'll see that his understanding of the marital union is not only that men have an authority, but that authority is based on women's lesser reason, which he pulls straight out of Aristotle.
Mhm.
And so, that's something that basically, I mean, it's a place where Wollstonecraft was really pushing, is that, yes, she would say, men are superior physically. There's no question about that. And she even left it open. Like maybe they are also superior morally, but maybe you should give women the chance and
Mhm.
actually educate them, so to see if they might cultivate their reason, so that they can govern themselves in terms of governing their own appetites and not be so dependent for every single thing on their husband's rational judgments, right? And because she said, like, how would women be able to be the companions of their husbands? How would they be able to be great mothers and wives if they are actually fully beholden to another's reason? And so she really wanted the cultivation of them as these human beings that they are, human creatures that they are, because human creatures are those who have distinctively have reason. But that reason needs to be cultivated. We're not like born as virtuous people, right? We need to cultivate, especially like our practical wisdom and our capacity to have the strong principles in order to carry out those obligations we have to others in our families, as citizens, our friends, and all sorts of things like that.
Right. And another quote again, that you can judge how a society is doing by the virtue of its women, right? And that really women set the tone. And they used to set the tone. And currently, because of modern feminism, there's a new tone, and I guess, that's what's changing right now. So what do you hope your daughters or the next generation of young women hear that this generation may have missed, and what should they take, from your work?
So my daughters hear so much from me and are all, yeah, no, really beautiful, wonderful human beings that I would say. I mean, I guess the thing that I'm most interested in right now is the way in which a lot of the very same temptations that Wollstonecraft was um, really kind of trying to persuade women to not fall into are the very same temptations that women are contending with today, which makes perfect
Mhm,
sense because we are who we are, and women and men don't change so much in terms of their natures, right? But I think there are ways in which like women have kind of um, lower that they have temptations to kind of follow the kind of base impulses and most the lowest desires of their nature, and I say men would be the same thing, and
yeah,
in following those kind of base desires that they can kind of look caricaturely like what, might be called by the opposite sex to be, well, that's really what woman is, and that's really what man is. Like men, like, feminists will say men are boorish and dominating. And when really that's like temptations of men's nature that, and they haven't cultivated themselves to be actually gentlemen, right? Which is the call for all men to be.
mhm,
To really use their strength for the good and the common good of others, especially the vulnerable, right? And on the same way, you could say, like, men, like, say on the far right, will look at women and say, oh, look, they're just like these over emotionally, who just like care about superficialities and putting on makeup or whatever. And so those are kind of the temptations too that women have, that I think aren't like those are both kind of toxic virtues. I mean, toxic instantiations of femininity and masculinity instead of really the cultivation of woman into like a full human being, I would say, right? And so what does that mean? It's that yes, women's beauty is lovely. But it's something that ought not like take the whole of her, like, and like the way in which she can attract kind of the male gaze ought not be her whole person, right? And so you
mhm,
see, the horrors and the sadness of like people on OnlyFans. I'm forgetting her
mhm,
name now, where she said like, I'm going to basically be exploited and looked at by men in a way that's like sexually, I can't remember the words that she used, and I can't remember the woman, but anyway, looked at like sexually objectifying, so I might as well objectify myself and make money
mhm,
from it, and so it's like that lowest aspect of what it is that a woman can kind of use her sexual wiles to, in a vicious way to kind of pull a man. I think,
mhm,
like, really, we ought to be thinking of women as fully human beings who, as Wollstonecraft would say, like, their gentleness, because it's like a virtue of the divine, ought to be a virtue of both men and women. Um, and beauty can be something wonderful, but it shouldn't be like the whole of the person. And so I think like really trying to understand like what the substance of a person is, substance of a person as one who is cultivated in virtue. And do those virtues look different in men and women? Sure, absolutely. Like the courage of a woman looks different from a courage of the man, unless of course she's being courageous on a battlefield or,
mhm,
in saving, vulnerable people from a burning building or something like that, picking them up in front of cars and like putting themselves into risk, which men tend to do more easily, right? The
mhm,
courage of a woman is like standing up for principle, not allowing her fears to dictate her actions. So the courage of a woman is like having a baby when she's not doesn't know how it's all going to work out. Like what a courageous woman, right? So I think that's what I would say is like, well, first I would say read Mary Wollstonecraft,
mhm,
because I think there's so much in there that helps us to see like what the substance of a woman really is. Is it's in those relationships, just like a man has those relationships of motherhood and fatherhood that are so beautiful, but it's also in like how to become someone who is not just beholden to kind of what everybody thinks of them, but really is, as I say to my children, like you have an audience of one, and that is God. And so, to be the person that to be the man or the woman that God is calling you to be, which requires a lot of humility and docility and prayer. Um, and kind of work at it, right? It's hard. And it requires also the guidance of others. And often it is men guiding men and women guiding women, that really helps us a lot to grow, in the virtue so that we can be, wise and make good decisions after taking counsel and all of that. And we can be, courageous and as well as modest and have, our sexual appetites in check as well.
Beautifully said. And lastly, if our listeners remember one moral truth from your book and from Mary Wollstonecraft's thought, what should it be?
Gosh, one moral truth. Um, that is a very hard one. I mean, I think I guess I'll just go with, um, something that maybe we haven't talked as much about, and just how, moving off this last thing I said about this audience of one, that to be, for our reason actually to flourish, to be the best it can be, that it has to have light on it, and that we can't just kind of like logically work out everything on our own, that we have like traditions and we have, traditions of thought, but we also have like the light of faith, and that faith is a kind of light on our reason, that it's not something that is, um, that makes reason less, it actually makes reason more. And that's really, what she understood reason to be, that I think is really beautiful, and it helps us to kind of put her in the context both of her time, but to understand, um, how kind of important it is to be in relationship with our creator, who is, as she would say, like all like his reason is all his wisdom is always, in, connected with his love and his benevolence for us, and to have that trusting relationship with our creator, with our God, is really helpful to being able to make wise decisions. And I think like that would probably be, um, to trust kind of the unerring reason of God, as she would say, and to put ourselves and subordinate ourselves to God's wisdom.
Well, thank you so much, Erica, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your passion for women and really just kind of improving society and moving us in the right direction. So, thank you again, Erica, and we will love to have you back.
Thanks, Serena, for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.